Welcome to topic 1.5. In this video, we are going to begin to delve into, we're going to be doing order of operations essentially, but with a twist. So let's first talk about square root, what square roots are. So square roots are the mathematical opposites of something squared. So what that means is let's use that definition to figure out this here. So we know that the square root is the opposite of something squared. So if we have 4 squared, well, 4 squared is 4 times 4, right? And 4 times 4, that equals 16. So if we were then to take that 16 and square root it, what do you think the square root of 16 would be? Well, let's see. We know 16 is equivalent to 4 squared. And since the square root is the opposite of something squared, essentially what happens is the square root and the squared cancels, and we just get 4. So the square root of 16 equals 4, and 4 squared equals 16. Notice that relationship there. So the square root is the opposite of something squared, just as addition is the opposite of subtraction, and division is the opposite of multiplication. Now we also have to look into something called absolute value. An absolute value is defined as the distance a number is from 0, or a variable. So let's look at a couple examples. So let's see, what is the absolute value of 2? Well, if we draw a number line, 0 is here. We have 1 and 2. How many units is 2 away from 0? Well, that is 1, 2 units. So absolute value of 2 is 2. But what if we said the absolute value of negative 2? Do you think that would be the same? Would it be different? Well, let's see. Let's imagine at the number line. Let's draw out negative 1, and then negative 2 is over here. Well, let's see how far it is, how many units it is away from 0. Well, we have 1, 2 units. So the answer is 2. Now, what do we think? Let's try the absolute value of negative 100. Would that still be positive? It would still be positive, because imagine negative 100 on the number line, it's talking about units and distance. And distance can never be negative, right? So absolute value, anything with absolute value is always positive. So let's write that down as a rule, because that is a very important thing to remember. Absolute value is always positive. Okay. Now with that in mind, let's get into our examples for this section. Now, we are going to have to take the given variables and evaluate the expression using order of operations. So we have the absolute value of x plus 3 all cubed, where x is equal to negative 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the value of negative 4, and we're going to plug it in wherever there's an x, because x is equal to that value. So what this looks like, let's say I'm going to assign the color blue for x. So what this looks like is we're going to get the absolute value of x, which is negative 4, plus 3, all cubed. And we're going to close the absolute value bars. So using order of operations, recall we do whatever is in parentheses first. So we have to first do negative 4 plus 3. Well, negative 4 plus 3, that's just negative 1. So we have the absolute value of negative 1 cubed. Well, negative 1 cubed is just negative 1. So we have the absolute value of negative 1. And recall the absolute value of anything is always positive. So absolute value of -1 is just 1. And that's your final answer. Looking at example number 2, we have to evaluate the square root of x plus the square root of y, where x is equal to 4 and y is equal to 9. So let's say x is green this time, and I'm going to say y is like this orange, or this more like yellowish color. Okay, so we have the square root of x, which is 4. And then we're going to add the square root of 9, which is this yellowish color. Well, but we have to, what are we going to do here? Well, as we've seen above, right, the square root is the opposite of something squared. So to figure out what the square root of 4 and the square root of 9 is, so we have to think, what can we square to get to 4? And I encourage you to pause the video and try this on your own if the answer doesn't pop in your head. And assuming you have thought about it, well, we can square 2 to get to 4. Because what's 2 squared? 2 squared is 4. So if we write 2 squared underneath the square root, this is still a correct way to write this, because 2 squared is the same value as 4. Then we're going to add square root of 9. But what can we square to get to 9? Well, we can square 3. 3 squared. And now, because we know the square root is the opposite of something squared, these square roots and squareds cancel. So we're left with 2 plus 3. And 2 plus 3, well, that's just 5. And that's your final answer. Now, I encourage you to pause the video and try example number 3 on your own. And assuming you have given it a go, let's work through it. So let's say x is green again, and we're going to say y is this yellowish color. Okay, so we're going to evaluate the absolute value of x squared, and x is -2. And then we're going to subtract the absolute value of y, which is -7. Squared minus the absolute value of x, and x is -2, minus y, and y is -7. Okay, so let's first simplify everything. Let's first simplify this absolute value, this absolute value, and this absolute value. So looking at -2 squared, or the absolute value of -2 squared, the first thing I'm going to do using PEMDAS is evaluate this exponent here. Now recall from the first section when we were doing order of operations, because there are no parentheses, well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Now, this can be a little bit confusing, but given the context that we're squaring x, and x equals -2, we're going to be squaring that whole x in this case. Given that x equals -2, and we're squaring x, we're squaring this whole thing. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One thing to be very careful of. So notation is very important. So this means that we're going to do -2 times -2, and that equals the absolute value of 4. And we're going to subtract that by, well, we have the absolute value of -7, which that's just 7. And so we're going to have 7 squared minus -2 minus -7. Well, when we subtract a negative, that becomes addition. So we're going to subtract the absolute value of -2 plus 7. Now, the absolute value of 4, that's just 4. Minus 7 squared, that's 49. And then we're going to subtract negative 2 plus 7. Well, negative 2 plus 7, that just becomes the absolute value of 5. The absolute value is just 5, so we're just going to get 4 minus 49 minus 5. And this ends up evaluating to negative 50. That's your final answer.